The Nexus Military Academy had welcomed stranger creatures and humans, but few had proven quite so entertainingly dense. At least, that was a prevailing opinion among the faculty as they watched Cadet Jenkins stumble through a third day of xenobiology orientation with the grace of concussed asteroid. "Tell me again about the respiratory mechanics," Jenkins said, pen poised over her datapad like a weapon she had no idea how to wield. She was addressing Commander Zexthal, whose crystalline form refracted the classroom's ambient light into prismatic patterns that would have been beautiful if his patients hadn't been wearing thinner than solar wind. For the fourth time, Cadet Zexthal's harmonic voice carried a particular frequency that indicated barely controlled irritation among his people. The Vorthack respiratory system operates through thermal absorption. We do not breathe in the primitive sense your species requires. Jenkins nodded with the earnest concentration of someone trying to understand quantum mechanics through interpretive dance. Right, but what happens when the ambient temperature drops below your optimal range? Do you have backup systems? The question hung in the air like an unwelcome smell. Several of the alien cadets exchanged glances that needed no translation across species barriers. Even the Epherans, who existed primarily as sentient gas clouds and thus had no faces to speak of, managed to convey collective eye-rolling through subtle shifts in their chromatic patterns. Backup systems? Commander Zexthal's crystalline structure flickered with what his people called the light of profound disbelief. "Cadet Jenkins, this is basic xenophysiology. The Vorthack have dominated 17 star systems precisely because we do not require such crude contingencies." "Oh." Jenkins scribbled something down with the fervor of a scholar discovering fire. "And the 17 systems you mentioned, are they all within similar thermal ranges?" The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as a weapon of psychological warfare. Cadet Morthak, a towering Kron warrior whose species had perfected the art of looking perpetually irritated, finally broke it with sound that might have been laughter if laughter could kill small animals. "Did the human just ask if we conquered 17 star systems by accident?" Morthak's translator rendered his words in standard, though his tone needed no interpretation. "Perhaps she thinks we stumbled into galactic dominance while looking for a suitable climate." The other cadets rippled with amusement. The Epheran shifted through colors that roughly translated to various forms of mockery, while a cluster of insectoid Zephirites clicked their mandibles in patterns that sounded disturbingly like applause. Jenkins looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who had just realized she was the punchline to a joke she hadn't heard yet. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply." "Of course you didn't mean to imply anything," interrupted Instructor Valneth, one of the few faculty members who had bothered to study human psychology. "Your species rarely means to imply the fascinating things they actually reveal." Valneth was what the diplomatic corps politely termed a composite being, part organic, part synthetic, and entirely convinced of their own intellectual superiority. They had made a career of studying what they called primitive cognitive patterns, and humans had provided them with enough material for several dissertations. "Now, Cadet Jenkins," Valneth continued with the tone of someone explaining fire to cave dwellers, "perhaps you could enlighten us about human respiratory requirements. I understand your species has some rather unique vulnerabilities." Jenkins brightened as if she had been handed an unexpected gift. "Well, humans need oxygen, obviously. About 21% atmospheric concentration is optimal. We can survive in lower concentrations for a while, but anything below 16%, and we start to experience cognitive impairment. Above 30%, and we become susceptible to oxygen toxicity." She paused, glancing around the room at faces that ranged from amused to openly contemptuous. "Actually, that raises an interesting question. How do mixed species operations handle atmospheric requirements? I mean, what happens during emergency situations when life support systems are compromised?" The question was met with the kind of silence typically reserved for moments when someone had just asked whether gravity was merely a suggestion. Commander Zexthol's crystalline form darkened several shades. Emergency protocols are classified information. Cadet, perhaps you should focus on mastering basic concepts before concerning yourself with operational security. Oh, right. Sorry. Jenkins returned to her notes with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been reminded that curiosity killed more than just cats. It's just that I read about the Battle of Kepler 442, and I was wondering how the mixed crews handled the atmospheric breach in Section C when... The Battle of Kepler 442 is not study material for first-year cadets. Valnev cut her off with the efficiency of a surgical laser. Perhaps we should move on to something more appropriate to your current level of understanding. Morthak leaned back in his reinforced chair, which creaked under the weight of his armored bulk. I vote we discuss nutrition. Humans have such delightfully simple dietary requirements. The suggestion was met with murmurs of agreement from around the room. Nothing quite entertained a mixed species class like discussing the eating habits of the galaxy's most primitive members. Excellent idea, Cadet Morthak. Valneth activated the room's holographic display, which immediately filled with images of various foods from across known space. Cadet Jenkins, perhaps you could explain human nutritional needs to your classmates. Jenkins studied the display with the intensity of someone trying to decode ancient hieroglyphs. Well, humans are omnivores. We require proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. We can synthesize some nutrients internally, but we need to obtain most of them from external sources. How wonderfully primitive, commented one of the Ephorans, their gaseous forms shifting to a particularly smug shade of purple. My people sustain ourselves entirely through atmospheric filtering, and the Kron require only protein and certain metallic compounds, Morthak added, his voice carrying the pride of someone whose species had evolved past the inconvenience of vegetables. Jenkins nodded enthusiastically. That's fascinating. So if someone wanted to incapacitate a Kron unit, they would need to target your protein synthesis pathways or create metallic compound deficiencies. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Morthak's hand moved instinctively toward where his weapon would have been if cadets were permitted to carry them during academic sessions. That, he said slowly, is a remarkably specific question for someone who supposedly struggles with basic xenobiology. Jenkins blinked with the innocence of someone who had just accidentally discovered fire while trying to make toast. I'm sorry. I was just thinking about the logistics. In human military history, understanding supply lines and nutritional requirements was crucial for strategic planning. I assumed it would be the same for other species. Human military history. Valnev repeated with the tone of someone discussing the combat tactics of particularly aggressive mushrooms. Yes, I suppose your species would find such primitive approaches relevant. The dismissal was so complete that it practically echoed. Jenkins returned to her notes, scribbling away with renewed dedication while the rest of the class moved on to discussing more suitable topics for someone of her clearly limited capabilities. What none of them noticed was a pattern in her questions, or the way her pen moved with the precision of someone taking very specific notes. They were too busy being entertained by the spectacle of human inadequacy to recognize intelligence gathering when it was happening right in front of them. After all, who would suspect a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel of engaging in systematic reconnaissance during what was obviously remedial education? By the end of the session, Jenkins had been quietly reassigned to the remedial xenological studies track, a decision that was met with general approval from faculty and students alike. It was, they agreed, the kindest possible solution for someone so clearly out of her depth. Commander Zexthal filed his report that evening with particular satisfaction. The human would receive the additional support she so obviously needed, and the rest of the class could proceed without the constant interruption of her bewildering questions. It was, everyone agreed, a perfectly reasonable solution to a perfectly obvious problem. None of them bothered to wonder why someone who struggled so obviously with basic concepts had managed to ask such remarkably specific questions about their weaknesses. The remedial xenological studies program had been designed with the best of intentions, which was to say it had been designed by committees who had never actually met a remedial student. The result was a curriculum that managed to be both patronizing and accidentally informative, rather like a textbook written by someone who had learned about warfare exclusively through children's picture books. Jenkins found herself surrounded by what the Academy politely termed specialized learners, a collection of beings who had proven themselves spectacularly unsuited for standard military education. There was Kixtel, a silicon-based life form who insisted on eating the furniture, and Brindar, whose species experienced temporal perception in reverse, and thus spent most classes predicting quiz answers before questions were asked. It was, Jenkins reflected while pretending to struggle with a tactical simulation, the perfect environment for someone who needed to appear harmless while conducting reconnaissance. I don't understand why the Vorthack units always position themselves near heat sources, she announced during their morning strategy session, staring at the holographic battlefield with the concentrated bewilderment of someone trying to solve mathematics through pure willpower. Wouldn't that make them predictable? Professor Kethen, an elderly Zephyrite who had drawn the short straw for remedial duty, clicked his mandibles in what his species considered patient explanation. Heat sources provide energy efficiency. Cadet Jenkins. The Vorthack cannot function optimally without thermal input. But what if someone used that against them? Jenkins asked, her voice carrying the theoretical innocence of someone pondering purely academic questions. Like, if you wanted to disable a Vorthack formation, couldn't you just introduce rapid temperature fluctuations? The question caused Professor Kethen's antennae to twitch, a sign of what humans might have recognized as mild alarm if they had bothered to study Zephyrite body language. That would be theoretically possible, yes, though such tactics would be considered extremely unethical. Oh, absolutely. Jenkins agreed with the fervor of someone who had just discovered the concept of ethics. I was just curious about the practical applications. How rapid would the fluctuations need to be? Kixtel looked up from methodically consuming a section of the conference table. 30-degree variance over 10-second intervals causes crystalline matrix destabilization. He offered helpfully, apparently under the impression that he was contributing to an academic discussion rather than a tactical briefing. Jenkins scribbled this down with the enthusiasm of someone taking notes on quantum physics. And what about electromagnetic interference? I noticed the FRN seemed to react strongly to EM fields during the simulations. Professor Kethen's mandible clicking increased in frequency, a development that would have concerned anyone familiar with Zephyrite stress responses. The FRNs maintain cohesion through quantum entanglement. Disruption of their electromagnetic environment can cause difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Jenkins leaned forward with the eager attention of someone genuinely fascinated by the subject matter. Temporary consciousness dispersal. Brindar announced from where he sat backwards his chair, facing away from the group. They become confused, disoriented, easy targets for approximately 14 minutes. The professor's antennae drooped noticeably. Cadet Brindar, please refrain from providing tactical vulnerabilities during academic discussions. But she asked. Brindar pointed out with the logic of someone experiencing the conversation in reverse. Besides, she's going to figure out anyway. I've seen how this ends. Jenkins tilted her head with curious confusion. Figure what out? Nothing. Professor Kethen said quickly. Cadet, Brindar sometimes experiences temporal displacement. Please disregard his comments. The conversation might have continued in this enlightening direction if Cadet Thexmore hadn't chosen that moment to join their study group. Thexmore was what the Academy classified as a crossover student. someone who had started in the standard program but had been transferred to remedial studies after repeated failures to grasp basic concepts. He was also, Jenkins had noticed, remarkably attracted by the standards of his species. The Helixians possess a kind of serpentine grace that many humanoid species found aesthetically pleasing, and Thexmore had the additional advantage of speaking standard with an accent that made everything sound vaguely romantic. "May I join your discussion?" he asked, settling onto the floor with fluid movements that suggested his species had evolved in environments where furniture was optional. "I've been having difficulty with the tactical simulations as well." Jenkins brightened in a way that had nothing to do with reconnaissance and everything to do with the fact that someone had finally spoken to her without open contempt. "Of course. We were just discussing environmental vulnerabilities in different species." Thexmore's head tilted in a gesture that was probably the Helixian equivalent of raised eyebrows. An unusual topic for remedial studies. Jenkins's curious interests, Professor Kethen explained with the weary tone of someone who has spent too many years dealing with students who asked inconvenient questions. We were attempting to redirect her focus toward more appropriate academic pursuits. "What kind of appropriate pursuits?" Thexmore asked, and Jenkins felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with intelligence gathering. "Basic species interaction protocols," Professor Kethen replied. "Communication standards, cultural sensitivity, proper diplomatic procedures." Jenkins seized the opportunity with both hands. "Actually, I was wondering about stress responses in different species. Like, how do you tell when Kron Warrior is experiencing combat fatigue? Or what happens when Vorthak are exposed to psychological pressure?" Thexmore's serpentine features arranged themselves into what might have been surprise. "Those are remarkably specific questions. I know they seem random," Jenkins said, allowing a note of embarrassment to creep into her voice. "It's just that humans have such obvious stress tells, increased heart rate, sweating, behavioral changes. But I can't figure out how to recognize the same things in other species. The Kron exhibit muscular rigidity and decreased reaction times under stress," Thexmore offered, apparently deciding that this was a reasonable academic discussion. "Their natural aggression becomes unfocused, almost desperate. And the Vorthak experience chromatic dulling when overwhelmed," added Kixtel, who had moved on to consuming the chair legs. "Their crystalline structures lose luminosity proportional to psychological strain." Jenkins wrote this down with the dedicated attention of someone taking notes on the meaning of life. "What about recovery times? How long does it take different species to return to optimal function after experiencing stress?" Professor Kethen's antennae were now twitching so rapidly they were practically vibrating. "Perhaps we should move on to less tactical discussions. But this is fascinating," Thexmore said, and Jenkins felt that flutter again. "Humans really are remarkably observant about these details. I hadn't considered how species-specific stress responses might affect mixed-unit operations." "Mixed-unit operations?" Jenkins repeated with the tone of someone who had just heard a new and exciting concept. "Standard procedure for most academy graduates," Thexmore explained. "Very few military actions involve single-species crews anymore. Understanding how different species function under pressure is actually quite important for effective teamwork." Jenkins nodded eagerly. "So if you were planning an operation with mixed species, you need to account for each species' stress thresholds and recovery requirements." "Theoretically, yes," Thexmore agreed, "though I imagine the planning computers handle most of those calculations automatically." "Planning computers?" Jenkins asked with the innocent curiosity of someone who had never heard of such things. Professor Kethen made a sound that might have been a sigh if Zephyrite possessed lungs. "Perhaps we should focus on your upcoming xenology examination instead of hypothetical military scenarios." But Jenkins was already lost in conversation with Thexmore, asking questions about computer systems and operational planning with the enthusiastic attention of someone who had found both a fascinating subject and an attractive teacher. What none of them realized was that her interest in Thex Moore was entirely genuine, which made her intelligence gathering all the more effective. Nothing quite loosened tongues like the combination of academic discussion and romantic possibility. By the end of the session, Jenkins had acquired detailed information about stress responses, operational planning systems, and the growing conviction that Thex Moore was the first person at the Academy who didn't treat her like a particularly dim-witted pet. She was also beginning to realize that maintaining her cover was becoming complicated in ways that had nothing to do with military intelligence. The final examination arrived with all the ceremony of a funeral and twice the dread. Academy tradition dictated that graduating cadets demonstrate their competence through what the faculty euphemistically called comprehensive tactical assessment, a simulation so complex that even the computers occasionally needed therapy afterward. Jenkins stood in the staging area, wearing the kind of expression that suggested she was contemplating the mathematical probability of surviving the next 4 hours. Around her, the other remedial students displayed varying degrees of what could charitably be called confidence and more accurately described as impending panic. "Remember," Professor Ketton announced, his mandibles clicking with the rhythm of someone delivering last rites, "this is not a competition. You are being evaluated on basic competency, not tactical brilliance. Simply attempt to follow standard protocols and avoid catastrophic failure." The staging area buzzed with the nervous energy of beings who suspected they were about to provide entertainment for their betters. The main Academy cadets had already completed their examinations with the sort of effortless competence that came from superior breeding, advanced evolution, and the unshakable conviction that the universe owed them success. Jenkins found herself assigned to Team 7, which the Academy computers had designated as compensatory grouping for suboptimal performers. It was a diplomatic way of saying they'd gathered all the expected failures into one convenient package for easier disposal. Her teammates included Kixtel, who had spent the morning eating reconnaissance equipment, Brindar, who kept announcing battle outcomes before they happened, and Thex Moore, who gave her a smile that made her temporarily forget why she was supposed to be nervous. "The scenario parameters are loading now," announced the simulation coordinator, a bored-looking Zephyrite whose job satisfaction could be measured in negative integers. "Your objective is to secure the disputed mining station while minimizing casualties and maintaining operational security. Standard rules of engagement apply." The holographic environment materialized around them with the casual efficiency of technology that had long since stopped trying to impress anyone. They stood on the command deck of a frigate approaching an asteroid mining facility that had been occupied by hostile forces. The enemy composition was displayed on the tactical screen. 2 squads of Kron shock troops, a Vorthak technical specialist maintaining the station systems, and an Ephraim reconnaissance unit providing surveillance coverage. It was, by any reasonable standard, a force designed to make remedial students weep openly. "Well," Thex Moore said with a kind of optimism that indicated either courage or severe head trauma, "at least we know what we're facing." Jenkins studied the tactical display with what appeared to be confused concentration. "The Kron are positioned near the main power junction. Why would they put their heaviest troops in such an exposed location?" "Because they're aggressive idiots who think superior firepower solves everything," Kixtel offered, taking a bite out of control panel. "Also, that junction feeds the life support systems. Classic choke point control. But if someone disrupted the power flow," Jenkins mused aloud, "wouldn't that affect the Vorthak's operational capacity? Heat regulation systems would be the first to go offline." Brindar looked up from his console with the expression of someone watching a particularly interesting tragedy unfold. "She's going to figure out in approximately 37 seconds, he announced to no one in particular. "Figure what out?" Thex Moore asked, But Jenkins was already moving to the environmental controls. The atmospheric composition shows elevated electromagnetic activity near Section C, she said, her fingers dancing across the interface with sudden precision. That's where the Ephron unit is stationed. If we could generate a focused EM pulse. The words died in her throat as she realized what she was saying. Around her, her teammates had gone very still, watching her with expressions that ranged from confusion to dawning comprehension. Jenkins, Dexmore said slowly, how do you know about electromagnetic vulnerabilities in Ephron physiology? She opened her mouth to deliver some fumbling explanation about lucky guesses and beginner's intuition, but the simulation was already responding to her inputs. The tactical display showed power fluctuations cascading through the mining station systems, and the Vortex signature began flickering as thermal regulation failed. On the enemy communications channel, panic was spreading in 3 different languages as environmental systems began failing in precisely the sequence that would cause maximum confusion while maintaining life support. That's not possible, breathed Kixtel, his silicon-based metabolism allowing him to process information faster than his organic teammates. She's targeting species-specific weaknesses with surgical precision. Jenkins stared at the display, watching as the Kron formation abandoned their defensive positions to respond to what appeared to be critical system failures. The Ephron unit was already showing signs of electromagnetic disruption, their reconnaissance coverage degrading as coherence became difficult to maintain. I don't understand, she said, and for the first time since the simulation began, her confusion was entirely genuine. I just thought about what we discussed in class, and then the realization hit her like a collapsing star. Weeks of innocent questions, casual conversations, and academic curiosity had created a comprehensive database of vulnerabilities that her subconscious mind was now deploying with terrifying efficiency. You've been gathering intelligence, Dexmore said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been betrayal or admiration. All those questions, all those discussions about stress responses and environmental factors. No, Jenkins protested, but even as she spoke, her hands continued working the controls. The mining station's defensive grid was collapsing in a pattern that exploited every weakness she had inadvertently cataloged. I was just trying to understand. Understand what? Dexmore demanded. How to defeat us? The question hung in the air like an accusation, while the simulation continued its relentless progression. Enemy forces were falling back in disorder, their coordination shattered by failures they couldn't explain or counter. It was, by any military standard, a masterpiece of psychological warfare. And Jenkins had accomplished it by accident. The simulation is concluding, the coordinator announced with the tone of someone who had just watched the laws of physics file a formal complaint. Team 7 has achieved primary objectives with 0 casualties and minimal resource expenditure. Timed completion, 43 minutes, 17 seconds. The holographic environment dissolved, leaving them standing in the staging area surrounded by silence that could have been used to suffocate small planets. Other remedial teams were staring at them with expressions that suggested they had just witnessed either a miracle or the apocalypse. 43 minutes, Professor Kethen repeated, his antennae twitching so rapidly they were generating their own weather patterns. The previous record for the scenario was 2 hours and 38 minutes, set by a team of advanced tactical students. Jenkins looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing suspicion where there had once been condescension, fear where there had been amusement. Even Dexmore was watching her with the expression of someone who had just realized they had been swimming with sharks. I think, she said quietly, there's been some kind of mistake. But as the Academy computers began analyzing the simulation data, calculating the probability that someone with her supposed limitations could have achieved such results, Jenkins realized that mistakes were luxuries she could no longer afford. The masquerade was ending, and she wasn't entirely certain she was ready for what came next. The Academy's administrative complex had been designed by architects who believed that intimidation was a legitimate decorative choice. Jenkins sat in a chair that cost more than most planetary defense budgets, facing a tribunal of beings whose collective disapproval could have powered a small moon. Admiral Kexval presided over proceedings with the sort of presence that made gravity seem negotiable. The ancient Kron-scarred carapace told stories of battles fought when Jenkins's homeworld was still cooling, and his eyes held a particular clarity that came from having personally violated several laws of physics. "Cadet Jenkins," he began, his voice carrying harmonics that made the room's crystal fixtures resonate sympathetically. "Your performance in yesterday's examination has raised certain questions." To his left sat Director Yulmeth, whose species had evolved beyond the need for physical form but maintained corporeal manifestation purely for administrative convenience. Their energy patterns pulsed with bureaucratic irritation. "The statistical analysis is quite conclusive," Yulmeth announced, data streaming across their luminous surface. "The probability of achieving your results through random chance is approximately 1 in 47 billion. Jenkins maintained the expression of someone who had stumbled into the wrong courtroom. "I'm not sure I understand what you're implying." "We're not implying anything," said the third member of the tribunal, Professor Zalcourt, whose crystalline Vorthack form reflected light in patterns that suggested barely contained fury. "We're stating facts. Your questions over the past weeks demonstrate systematic intelligence gathering on military vulnerabilities. The evidence materialized in holographic form around them. Transcripts of conversations, analysis of her inquiries, pattern recognition algorithms that had finally connected us. The faculty had been too arrogant to notice. It painted a picture of reconnaissance, so thorough it bordered on artistic. This compilation represents the most comprehensive vulnerability assessment of Alliance military forces ever conducted by a single individual." Admiral Kexval observed with something that might have been professional admiration. "The depth of analysis suggests years of preparation." Jenkins watched her carefully constructed facade crumble in real time. There seemed little point in maintaining the pretense when faced with evidence this overwhelming. "Actually," she said, allowing her voice to lose its carefully cultivated uncertainty, "it took about 18 months. Your education materials are surprisingly comprehensive once you learn how to ask the right questions." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Director Yulmeth's energy patterns shifted to configurations that resembled profound alarm. "You admit to conducting espionage operations against Alliance military forces?" Professor Zalcourt demanded, his crystalline structure darkening with indignation. "I admit to learning," Jenkins replied with the sort of calm that comes from dropping pretenses. "Isn't that what students are supposed to do?" Admiral Kexval leaned forward with interest that was decidedly predatory. "And what exactly did you learn, Major Jenkins?" The title hung in the air like a death sentence. Jenkins felt the last vestiges of her cover identity dissolve as the tribunal's real knowledge became apparent. "You knew," she said, not bothering to make a question. "We suspected," Admiral Kexval corrected. "Human intelligence rarely sends their people to military academies for remedial education. The assignment required confirmation." The holographic displays shifted, revealing classified dossiers that made Jenkins's supposed academic records look like children's coloring books. Her real service history materialized in damning detail. 17 successful intelligence operations, decorations for strategic analysis, and a reputation for psychological manipulation that earned her the unofficial title of the Confessor. Major Elena Vasquez, Director Yulmeth read from her actual file. Age 34, specializing in interspecies intelligence gathering and strategic vulnerability assessment. Currently assigned to Project Deep Current, a classified evaluation of Alliance military capabilities. Jenkins, Vasquez, settled back in her chair with the resigned air of someone whose professional life had just become significantly more complicated. I suppose asking how you figured it out would be purely academic at this point. Your romantic involvement with Cadet Dexmore was illuminating. Professor Zalcourt observed with clinical detachment of someone discussing weather patterns. Emotional attachment tends to compromise operational security. The words hit harder than Jenkins had expected. Her carefully professional demeanor cracked slightly as she considered the implications. Dexmore knows. Cadet Dexmore has been debriefed. Admiral Kexval confirmed with the casual brutality of someone delivering routine information. His cooperation proved most educational regarding your methods. The betrayal shouldn't have stung as much as it did. Jenkins had used emotional manipulation as a tool for years, but she had genuinely believed that her feelings for Dexmore were separate from her mission. The realization that even her authentic emotions had become intelligence assets was professionally embarrassing and personally devastating. He was quite detailed in his descriptions of your conversations, Director Yulmeth added helpfully, particularly regarding stress responses and operational planning systems. Jenkins absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone whose career had just taken a turn toward the catastrophic. I assume you'll be filing formal espionage charges. Admiral Kexval's laugh was a sound that could have cracked armor plating. Major, you've just provided us with the most comprehensive security audit in Alliance history. Why would we charge you with improving our defenses? The statement reframed everything Jenkins thought she understood about her situation. She looked around the tribunal with growing suspicion. You're not arresting me. We're reassigning you, Professor Zalcourt clarified. Your analysis has identified weaknesses that require immediate attention. Who better to develop countermeasures than the person who discovered the vulnerabilities? The proposal was elegant in its cynicism. Jenkins would become the architect of defenses against tactics she had proven devastatingly effective. It was a sort of professional irony that intelligence agencies found endlessly amusing. And if I refuse, then your return to Earth with a commendation for exceptional service and the knowledge that your work here will be classified for the next century, Admiral Kexval replied. Though I suspect you'll find the alternative assignment more stimulating. Jenkins considered her options with a methodical thoroughness that had made her effective at intelligence work. The Academy had outmaneuvered her completely, transforming her espionage operation into a recruitment exercise. It was, she had to admit, remarkably elegant manipulation. What about Dexmore? She asked, surprised by her own concern for someone who had just betrayed her professional secrets. Cadet Dexmore will continue his studies, Director Yulmeth assured her, though perhaps with a better understanding of the complexities involved in interspecies relationships. The dismissal was complete and final. Jenkins had entered the academy as a spy pretending to be a student, and she was leaving as a consultant who had learned more than she intended to teach. As she stood to accept her new assignment, Jenkins reflected on the peculiar irony of her situation. She had come to the academy to assess Alliance weaknesses, and instead discovered that the Alliance's greatest strength lay in its ability to transform enemies into assets. It was, she decided, a lesson worth learning, even if the tuition had cost her more than she had intended to pay. Outside the administrative complex, the Academy continued its eternal cycle of education and evaluation, preparing young beings for a universe that was more complicated than any of them suspected. And somewhere in the remedial xenological studies program, new students were asking innocent questions about species vulnerabilities, unaware that curiosity itself had become a weapon.